But 30 years agone on this date today was the conclusion of what was considered at that time the successful conclusion of Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm, which was, of course, Gulf War II. Okay? Gulf War I was Iran versus Iraq, a 9-year war from 1980 through 1980 fucking 8. So we're talking about Gulf War One was a decade in which millions of Muslims died fighting each other in one of the costliest wars of the 20th century in the aftermath of World War II. And the veterans of that war on either side had seen it all. These were not men to break, and they are not men that in any way, shape, or form would have broken with the American deployment of modern weapons alone. Certainly, the most decisive factor that I would argue was the final duty of Michael Aquino in uniform to call upon the anti-gods, specifically Al Cthulhu, within the desert regions. He is known from the Quran, or Islam, the most holy book of Islam, the Quran. He is known as the Forsaker, and in the Arabic, Al Cthulhu. Now, 30 years on from Gulf War II, Operation Desert Storm, the consequences of that military deployment are still with us. This date today marks the 30th memorial of the conclusion of Desert Storm, the military operation to reverse Iraq's August 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm was the first major foreign crisis for the United States after the end of the Cold War, of which the American empire emerged the victor. Now, after a 20-week buildup of forces in the Persian Gulf region known as Operation Desert Shield, which in and of itself was a United Nations sanctioned, United States-led coalition of 35 nations, unleashing a 6-week air campaign followed by 4 days of ground combat, less than a work week, which drove the last Iraqi invaders from Kuwait on the 28th day in February 1991. Desert Storm was a military watershed, defining a modern large-scale combat and marking the American empire as the world's undisputed military superpower of the time. The brief conflict played a role in the dissolution of the former Soviet Union and prompted a revolution in military affairs response among all the world's powers. The Second Gulf War saw and by that I'm not referring to fucking Operation Iraqi Freedom, I'm referring to Operation Desert Storm, Iran-Iraq being the first Gulf War conflict. The Second Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm, saw the introduction of stealth, precision-guided munitions, and space support on an operational scale. It also saw the implementation of new concepts of operations, such as parallel warfare, in which numerous targets were destroyed simultaneously rather than in sequence, to blind, confuse, and disrupt an enemy, and effects-based operations, wherein the desired effect, rather than the type of platform or weapon deployed, was the driving factor in assigning forces to campaign tasks. Then there was a short message to end a short war. On February 26th of 1991, 48 hours before Operation Desert Storm was considered officially closed, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz put his signature to a letter addressed to the United Nations Security Council, which read, and I'll translate from the Arabic, I have the honor to notify you that the Iraqi government reaffirms its agreement to comply fully with Security Council Resolution 660 and all other UN Security Council resolutions. Now, a few hours later, at 8 a.m., or anti-meridium, which is what AM is acronymous for, Baghdad time, a ceasefire entered into effect. The international military campaign, dubbed by the American Empire as Operation Desert Storm, had lasted only a few weeks. And yet, as recent rocket attacks against American targets in Iraq so illustrate, its consequences are with us still today. But how did it all begin? The then Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, criticized what he saw as Kuwaiti economic treachery related to the production and pricing of oil. When Kuwait refused to lower its oil production, Saddam began what would become a short-lived military intervention in the neighboring oil-producing country. Saddam's motives, in fact, related to his need to replenish an impoverished Iraqi economy that had been severely undercut by a protracted and costly war against Iran, which had lasted nigh a decade. 9 very long years, which resulted in more than 1.5 million estimated Iraqi and Iranian deaths that either state is even willing to admit to. On the 2nd day of August in 1990, not quite grasping what the waning of the Cold War would mean for his own regional ambitions, Saddam Hussein ordered his well-equipped Iraqi army of elite Republican Guard troops to invade and annex the tiny Arab state of Kuwait, a major supplier of oil to the American Empire, above all other parties of interest, which brought the United States in reflexively after that oil-rich nation refused to cancel the debt Iraq had incurred while warring against Iran throughout the majority of the 1980s. At the time of the invasion, the United States Navy was already on station in the region. The ships of Joint Task Force Middle East were immediately placed on alert. Battle groups led by the USS Independence, carrier vessel 62, and the USS, or United States ship Dwight D. Eisenhower, which was CVN, carrier vessel, and what was the N for? Well, fuck the acronym, it was numbered 69. They sped from the Indian Ocean and Eastern Mediterranean to take up positions in the Gulf of Oman and Red Sea, at the ready to commence sustained combat operations. When President George Herbert Walker Bush ordered the deployment of troops and equipment to defend the House of Saud on the Arabian Peninsula, otherwise known as Saudi Arabia, more than 240 ships carrying about 18.3 million pounds of equipment and supplies was facilitated. United Nations trade sanctions were immediately imposed against Iraq to sever the country's economy. When U.S. Marines began arriving in Saudi Arabia, their supplies and equipment were in close proximity due to low-key military ties with friendly Arab states. More than 21,000 naval reservists were called to active duty in support of Desert Shield that would become Desert Storm. During the 6-month buildup to Operation Desert Storm, U.S. News and World Report reported that the Pentagon expected upward of 30,000 American troops would be killed and others injured if a shooting war with the Iraqis erupted. Even the deputy commander-in-chief during Desert Storm, General Calvin A.H. Waller, said he expected a casualty rate of 40% of his frontline units, and that the war would last just over a week. 2 days to breach the Iraqi frontline defenses, followed by 6 days of tank battles against the elite Republican Guard and their mechanized armored columns. Now, bear in mind that at that time, if I remember correctly, try and get out the numbers from what's left of my brain that I haven't fried with too many drugs. That would have been a fatality rate of a lot of men. It would be something that the United States simply could not even probably sustain. 40% of what was probably 500,000 men is incredible. It would be something that we haven't seen since World War II. So, the reason for this expectation on the most negative scale should be obvious. Nigh a decade of war between Iraq and Iran had turned the Iraqi army into a professional force of military veterans that had more combat experience than any American servicemen in the field. These were men who had seen it all, including children thrown against them by the Iranians, so that the Iranians could begin to conserve their adult forces towards the end of that war. So the Iraqi service veterans had killed children deployed against them when they had to. These men were not cowards. They were not going to break. This was something that most Americans have no concept of based on all of the propaganda they are fed on the concept that the Arab soldier is someone who perennially deserts. So, it took Michael Aquino to even the odds. Now, once diplomatic and economic pressure to deter Saddam failed, the American empire, under then-President George H.W. Bush, assembled the largest international coalition since the Second World War. And, with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council, began a 5-week military operation that pushed Saddam's forces back into Iraq and reinstated the Kuwaiti royal family at the helm of their country. The United States and Great Britain, along with a gaggle of nearly 40 countries, the so-called Coalition of the Willing, launched a relentless and devastating air offensive that took out key Iraqi defenses and softened up the front lines. The United States Navy provided sea control and maritime superiority, which paved the way for the introduction of U.S. and Allied and ground forces, both air and ground forces of the American empire and its allies. The subsequent bombardment by aerial assets and the effects of the economic embargo decimated Iraq's military infrastructure and morale, degraded communications and supplies, and devastated weapons arsenals. During the beginnings of the war, Navy ships launched salvos of Tomahawk cruise missiles against military targets in Iraq to soften the battlefield for ground troops. 7 B-52s launched from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana took off on the 16th day in January of 1991, carrying then secret GPS or geosynchronous positional satellite guided missiles, cruise missiles, to the Gulf region and releasing them from standoff ranges into Iraq after a 17-hour flight. The missiles were targeted against command and control nodes, Iraqi leadership, power plants, and a telephone exchange. Now air units deployed in countries inside and outside the Persian Gulf region, as well as from aircraft carriers in surrounding bodies of water, followed up with an unrelenting rain of munitions on Iraqi fielded forces both in Kuwait and Iraq itself, destroying in 42 days roughly half of all that country's fielded forces. The air campaign began with strikes on sensors and command and control capabilities, which blinded Iraqi forces and denied them the ability to coordinate any defense. Coalition aircraft attacked airfields to prevent the Iraqi Air Force from mounting a defense against the Allied aerial armada, and in the latter stages hit individual armored vehicles with precision weapons called tank plinking to inflict massive attrition on Iraq's ground forces. 27 United States military aircraft went down during that conflict, and Iraq held 21 Americans as prisoners of war. Now, despite a warning to Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein by U.S. President George H.W. Bush that prisoners must be treated humanely, as would Iraqi prisoners held by the coalition, he so said, American pilots were beaten and tortured, and some forced to make anti-coalition videos. And not all of those prisoners were repatriated. There are still lost American pilots from that war. Now, despite widespread fears that Saddam would deploy chemical weapons against coalition forces, as had been used throughout the Iran-Iraq conflict, which resembled more than anything else the conduct of the First World War, the ground war began on the 24th day in February after nearly 40 fucking days of aerial bombardment. You couldn't even call it combat. No Americans on the ground seemed to know exactly where the enemy was or what they were even doing. The weather didn't help matters much. Cold rain, steely winds, and blowing needles of sand. The ground war ended but 100 hours later. In a mere 100 hours, 100,000 Iraqi fighters were killed, and the Iraqi army itself was crushed. Another 100,000 Iraqi civilians are conservatively estimated to have died immediately due to starvation, dehydration, and total denial of medical supplies under embargo and sanctions from the United Nations. Now, military action included the systematic targeting of all Iraqi infrastructure, including the sustained and controversial attack against retreating Iraqi military personnel along the road connecting Kuwait with Iraq itself, when, in the last days of combat, hundreds of fleeing Iraqi vehicles consolidated onto a single road on their way out of Kuwait, where coalition air units could see and destroy them en masse, which was subsequently, well, it came to be known as the Highway of Death. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, argued to President Bush that to continue the carnage would be both un-American and unchivalrous, and damage to America's military credibility and moral authority with the world was irretrievable. Bush ordered a halt to the destruction, too late, allowing what surviving Iraqi troops there were to leave Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Kuwait was free again to reopen its oil pumps for American consumption. The rapid military campaign was a success, and its implications were potentially massive. Before the intervention, Bush had addressed the United States Congress, stressing the importance of the unique and extraordinary moment. To quote his team, "The crisis in the Persian Gulf offers a great opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, a new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace." And so an official ceasefire was struck on the third day in March of 1991, controversially leaving Saddam Hussein in total power. While coalition casualties were in the hundreds, and nigh all of them, almost to the last, by friendly fire. Americans killing each other. Immediate Iraqi military losses numbered in the tens of thousands. Though Bush was criticized by some for not pressing on to the Iraqi capital and conquering Iraq, he later pointed out that the United Nations mandates authorizing the operation did not call for that, and that the coalition would have likely broken up if the war had been expanded. He also had heeded Colin Powell's advice that if you break it, you buy it, meaning the United States would take over the physical and fiscal responsibility for the security and feeding of the Iraqi nation, which Bush, the senior Bush, said he was not prepared to do. He would leave that to his son and all of us paying taxes. The rapid success of the international military campaign, whose legitimacy was reinforced by the unequivocal United Nations authorization, ushered in an era of triumphalist confidence in the possibilities of such a new world order and in the American ability to mold it. If there be any truth to be told about the war all these years later, it's that the war never really ended. No wars ever do. The most obvious evidence that Desert Storm never ended is, of course, America's 2003 invasion of Iraq itself, which created immeasurable blowback that's still playing out today. In a less visible way, the war has continued in the hearts, minds, and souls of those who fought and survived it. About 12% of Gulf War veterans have been diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Of the veterans we know died by suicide, in the year 2014 alone, the last time I bothered to check the stats, 65% were old enough to have seen action during Desert Storm, Vietnam, or previous conflicts. More than 250,000 American troops who served in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991 were exposed to dangerous plumes of nerve gas and other chemical agents after Iraq's chemical weapons plant and storage sites were destroyed. As of 2015, which was again the next time I looked into the subject, veterans of Desert Storm who had been near those plumes were dying of brain cancer at 2 to 3 times the rate of troops who were stationed farther behind the front lines. I was one of those men. but I display no such symptoms, instead, it having affected me mechanically with multiple lung collapses, which ultimately required highly experimental surgery to staple my lungs to my rib cage while simultaneously literally scrubbing all of the blebs or chemical blisters burned into the inside of my lungs while my lungs were thusly exposed to surgical intervention. Many others suffer from Gulf War syndrome, which consists of a series of symptoms such as chronic headaches, chronic fatigue, and cognitive issues. Indeed, the issues are so far ranging and all across the spectrum that Congress was forced to create a legal fiction, Gulf War syndrome, which physically is not medically recognized as a reality. Rather, it's a legal fiction that enables the Veterans Administration to treat whatever symptoms manifest, because there's no single disease in the world that could possibly manifest such a wide-ranging spectrum of symptoms as manifest in Gulf War veterans. Indeed, originally, the acronym was GWIDS, GWIDS, Gulf War Immunodeficiency Syndrome. Very similar to CFIDS, CFIDS, or Chronic Fatigue Immunodeficiency Syndrome. And of course, AIDS, AIDS, Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, which is all Gulf War syndrome is, since it's acquired, a form of AIDS. So, is this something to celebrate? Back then, there were reasons to be optimistic. One of them related to the cooperation, unseen up to that point, between Americans and Soviets. Despite Iraq having been one of its main Cold War clients in the region, the Soviet Union quickly endorsed the American-led military operation. Indeed, at the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze were in a meeting together and rapidly issued a joint statement of condemnation of Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. Recently declassified sources show that the U.S.-Soviet cooperation back then was more difficult than the leaders' statements led the world to assume at the time. There is a book entitled Inside the Gorbachev-Bush Partnership on the First Gulf War, 1990. That way they at least qualify, even though they categorize the Gulf War wrongly as the first, it was the second, they at least give the year so as not to confuse the uninitiated. And sourcing their documents from the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library via the National Security Archives digital collection, the authors of that book, Svetlana Savranskaya and Tom Blanton, basically released a typed record of a phone conversation between the Secretary of State James Baker and the Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze that was taken on the 7th day in August of 1990 with, of course, the word secret written and later crossed out at the top. So we have declassified telephonic conversation that reveals the true U.S.-Soviet difficulties. Yet, speaking in October of 1991, the Soviet party chairman, Mikhail Gorbachev, underlined that, well, let me translate from the Russian. Without a radical improvement and then a radical change in Soviet-U.S. relations, and of course you notice he puts the Soviet before the U.S., that's of course his prerogative and his right, we would never have witnessed the profound qualitative changes in the world that now make it possible to speak in terms of an entirely new age, an age of peace in world history. Indeed, he added that the right conclusions have been drawn from the Gulf War. Oh, but had they? In Iraq, Saddam Hussein remained in power, and bombing and sanctions against his regime continued into Bill Clinton's presidency, until in 2003, in the wake of 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, the then President George W. Bush the Jr. declared a new war against Iraq with the disputed justification of Iraq's alleged development of weapons of mass destruction, where again Colin Powell appeared to disgrace himself forever in the eyes of history by touting one of his own urine samples as a weapon of mass destruction in a test tube smuggled out of Iraq. Now, many commentators saw the Third Gulf War, and if you want to use 1 and 2, instead of 1, 2, and 3, just say Bush War 1 and Bush War 2, because many saw this as a way to deal with the unfinished business of the first Bush War, Gulf War 2, started by Bush's father. Military contractors flooded into Iraq, with complex consequences that are still playing out. One of the last acts of the United States presidency of Donald John Trump involved pardoning 4 Blackwater security contractors whom were directly responsible, personally responsible for the 2007 Nizar Square massacre, a shooting that killed 14 Iraqi children, one of which they butchered mercilessly, a 9-year-old, Ali Abdul Razak. United Nations human rights experts have condemned the presidential pardon as an affront to international justice. But of course, no one is stopping someone from paying the money to hunt those bastards down and kill each one of them individually. The war of the early aughts, the 2000s, left behind a completely eviscerated Iraqi state infrastructure and an incalculable body count. A situation that rendered Iraq itself an easy prey to the forces of the Islamic State. ISIS, which took over Mosul in the year 2014, continuing a legacy of violence and brutalization that never needed to happen. Many saw the end of the 1991 Gulf War as the beginning of an age of peace. To quote Gorbachev, who was planning his own defection. The highest level dictator to ever defect, who should make the cover of every history book for that reason alone. The equivalent of if Adolf Hitler had defected from the Third Reich at the height of World War II. Or Joseph Stalin defecting at the height of the Korean conflict. Something that makes so little sense it boggles the mind. And yet happened because, yay, the Soviet Union was that bad, that dysfunctional, towards where its own leader realized it would no longer stand, conspired his defection, and allowed his empire to crumble into dust. The hope at that time was that the American empire would imbue the nation of Iraq and the entire region of Southwest Asia with the opportunity for prosperity. Instead, the ceasefire of February 28th, 30 years agone today, marked the end of a conflict that had been remarkably short, but whose consequences and unintended outcomes are still being felt to this day in every negative sense imaginable, and all too many that are inconceivable. One of them being the prisoners we took in by the hundreds, such as the men I led back behind the lines who helped us get through the anti-tank minefields alive, who had but one reason for their surrender. No one else besides myself could even speak Arabic, and therefore I understood what they said. Al-Cthulhu. Manifest to many of the Iraqis on the front lines were the anti-gods risen by Aquino in his last act in uniform to end a battle that otherwise would have cost the Americans incalculable losses, that would have resulted in protestation and likely a reformation of the entire military-industrial complex, instead delivered America into the hands of the military-industrial complex in a manner more subservient than it had ever been before. None of the weapons deployed could have done what Aquino's magics did. To men who had seen a decade of trench warfare, including weeks on end, wearing gas masks and surviving chemical assaults, only to disintegrate on the sands of Babylon, when before their eyes, unseen to any American optics, and only on a few sensors that are rumored to have been completely scrubbed or confiscated, the emergence of the anti-gods out of the sands and descendant from the skies took their very senses from them, and they fled en masse. America's soul died that day, whatever soul it had, in its final sealing of its doom in that bargain with that which is beneath demonic, beyond diabolic, and effectively all Americans were rendered chaos cultists at that point.